The book of Acts is considered to be essentially a continuation of the Gospel of Luke by the same author, right? The Gospel of Luke is the story of Jesus, and the book of the Acts of the Apostles is the story of the first followers of Jesus being Jesus in the world. We sometimes refer to the book of Acts as the story of the earliest days of the church, which is fine, I guess, as long as you remember the earliest part and not the church part. Because if you look at the book of Acts as being about the earliest days of the church as we know the church, that's a problem, because that's not what it's about. It's actually about what the church is supposed to be, not necessarily what it is. See, the book of Acts is the story of the first followers of Jesus sharing Jesus with the world. And I know what you're thinking right away. Well, that's what the church is about. Is it? We want to hope that. But maybe sometimes being the church isn't the same as being followers of Jesus. This is a really good story to remind us about that. A really good story to remind us about that. It might be even a familiar story that we hear often to remind ourselves of what the church is supposed to be. And we tell the story that way and say, what a wonderful story it is, and then we go back to being the church. Because sometimes being the church and being a follower of Jesus is not the same thing. Truly. Here's a story where an Ethiopian eunuch who has a particularly prestigious, high-ranking place in society goes to Jerusalem to worship. You might want to assume that the person is Jewish, but they might not be. You don't know, because it doesn't say. All we know is it's an Ethiopian eunuch who has a high-ranking position in their society. And they're on their way home again, reading from Isaiah, an important prophet. An angel sends Philip. And then throughout the rest of the story, we hear about how the Spirit moves Philip around. He meets the chariots, he gets on the chariot, he talks to the Ethiopian, and who says, I don't really understand this, can you help me? He says, sure, and he tells him about Jesus. This is a little bit of the problematic part of the story. I know what you're thinking, it's the rest of the other elements of the story are the problem. Nope. It's this moment. Because is this moment about how someone speaking to a Jewish person persuaded them to understand it as being a prophecy about Jesus? Or is it someone who was being Jesus in a way that illuminated someone's understanding? I like to think that this is a moment where Philip was being Jesus in that way that Madeleine L'Engle talks about. You know, in that famous quote from Madeleine L'Engle about, we bring people to Christ not by telling them how wrong they are or what they don't know, but by showing them a light so bright they want to be part of it. I think that's what's happening here. And sure enough, the Ethiopian is moved to the point where they say, is there anything to prevent me from being baptized? Look, there's some water. They hop out. Philip baptizes them. So let's look at some of the elements of this story for a second. We're just going to Bible study for a minute. Ethiopian eunuch on his way back from Jerusalem, who's a high-ranking official. A person of color who is a eunuch who has an important place in a society. And yet we don't know how that person would have been received in Jerusalem. We don't. Because he's a person of color who's a eunuch. The fact that he's an important official from another country might not have meant anything when he got to the temple. We don't know that piece of the story. What we do know is that there probably aren't many more things you could add to that description of the person to make them more of an outsider to someone like Philip. And yet, Philip is supposed to meet him. Let's talk about Philip for a second, too, by the way. This isn't Philip the apostle. This is Philip, who was one of the 7 people who were chosen by the A-team to go out and care for people. So it's not someone like Peter. It's not someone like John or James. It's not one of the important ones. It's somebody late. It's not even Matthias, who was added. He became number 12 to replace Judas. So it's not one of the most important figures. It's somebody who is just moved by the Spirit and has a role to care for people, to be Jesus, like you and me. And he meets him, and he doesn't say, here's what you're supposed to think. He helps him understand. And the Ethiopian's response to that is to say, look, there's water. Is there anything to prevent me from being baptized? And you know what Philip says? He says, you bet there is. You have to attend church for a certain number of Sundays. And by the way, there are classes. And then there'll be an interview. And then when we've decided that you're good enough, we might let you in. And don't forget your financial commitment to the church. That isn't what he says. And by the way, we didn't even address the often untalked about things. He's a person of color who's a eunuch. He couldn't be more different. Sure, he's an important official somewhere. That could be useful to the church. You see where this could go very easily. And yet it doesn't. Philip simply baptizes him, and they go on their way rejoicing, it says. And the Spirit moves Philip elsewhere. We sometimes look at the book of Acts as the earliest days of the church. But if we see that with the lens of the contemporary church, we have a problem. Because in those early days of the church, they weren't a church yet. They hadn't organized well enough to be a church yet. What they were trying to do is create communities of faith around a particular teaching, a particular understanding of Jesus. Didn't take long, though, before there were issues. Because if we're all meant to share in the common good of all things, but there are people from different levels and different places in society, what if there's people from different cultures? What if there's people I don't know? What if there's people I don't like? How do we welcome them? None of that was consideration to Philip. The Spirit moved Philip. That is a key part of this story. The constant mention of either an angel of the Lord or a spirit is moving Philip. It's the Spirit moving the church. And if the Spirit is alive in the church, how are we welcoming? How are we engaging? How are we inviting people? See, there's a big difference between an invitation and please meet this particular criteria before you can be part of our exclusive group. If we want to be truly inclusive, we want to invite people in and then say, look, we have to have some organization. We have to have some sort of administrative way of doing this. Okay, but before we get to the institution part, have we met that first and most important criteria? You are loved and welcomed just as you are as a child of God, because we are all children of God. Isn't that really the point of baptism? Is our acknowledgement of that. Rather than you have to meet criteria, and as part of the team now, we'll baptize you, and that's the sign that you're part of our exclusive group. Isn't the point of baptism simply that we are acknowledging what we already know? You're a child of God just as you are. That's what happens in this story. That's what Philip does in this story. He takes a moment to talk about Jesus. And yes, he's interpreting a Jewish prophecy as being revealed in Jesus. But he seems to have done it in such a way as to create an invitation that the Ethiopian embraces. It disturbs me greatly. I just did it, actually. I've been intentionally saying Ethiopian rather than eunuch because in the story they keep saying eunuch over and over and over again. Why can't we just say person in this story? Why do we have to be constantly making the point that this person is different than us? Even the person who wrote the story down was already doing what we do. And maybe, yes, maybe they were trying to make that very point. But the fact of the matter is, it shouldn't matter. Other than in our desire to embrace them, to invite them in, to affirm who they are as they are. That is what we're supposed to be about, after all. This story is quite early in the book of Acts, chapter 8, I think I said. It's quite early. We haven't set up a lot of communities yet. We haven't started to organize and connect them. We haven't started to institutionalize them yet. Maybe that's the point to go back to. Maybe the number of empty seats would be a little bit different. Maybe how people see from the outside would be different. Maybe how we understand each other outside of these walls would be different. If we just took a step back from the criteria we require for you to be a member of this group, and instead think about all it requires for us to be part of the family of God. The family of Jesus. However we know Jesus, however we know God. Because for Philip, all that meant was being able to share the story and embrace someone, however, whoever, whatever, however they can be described. That was only as something to embrace, not set apart.